Sometimes things just don't pan out the way you wanted. Smash Bros. Has seen several characters with large support bases who didn't make it onto the roster. A lot of the time they end up with some kind of secondary content, whether it's assist trophies or Mii Fighter costumes or stage elements or collectible trophies or spirits, which often only leaves their fans waiting and hoping that, at some point, they'll be given a second chance. While having these characters present in non-playable form is still something, we've had a lot of examples where it's led to strong reactions from their fans, especially with how much the internet loves jumping to conclusions. Vocal parts of the Smash community can and have interpreted it as if it must mean their favorites were deemed undeserving to be full-fledged newcomers, treating it like a slap to the face and responding accordingly as if they themselves had been snubbed. We've even seen a wide range of responses from people outside the character's support bases, ranging from sympathy toward the fallen, to words of encouragement that, hey, it's something at least, to opportunistically dunking on the character and their fans for a cheap laugh. But the thing is, this whole idea of secondary content equals not good enough to make the roster isn't what's actually going on. While many characters could work as playable fighters, I should know coming up with movesets is kind of my thing. Only so many can feasibly be added with each new game. Development on as massive a series as Smash Bros. Is even more complicated than it gets credit for, and the developers are only human, they can only handle so much. And with how Ultimate made bringing back everyone from every past entry its top priority, it led to more potential newcomers slipping through the cracks than usual, whether because of poor timing or being overshadowed by someone else or any other number of reasons. Some characters always end up missing the chance to join the fight themselves through no fault of their own. Being relegated to a costume or an assist trophy or the like isn't a knock against them, it's a way to include them somehow even if they weren't chosen to be newcomers. And the reason why it's not the black mark so many fans treat it as? Because we've seen several characters make the jump from NPC to fully playable between games, including a couple very notable cases in Ultimate already. Just because a character missed out and wound up with a consolation prize, it doesn't preclude them from getting a second chance down the line if the opportunity comes up. And that brings us to our challenger, or should I say challengers, hoping to join their predecessors in making the jump to playability, but not only would they have to follow in those characters' footsteps, they'd also need to break a barrier or two more to do so. And yet, the uncharted territory we've found ourselves in may just give them that chance. Rex and Pyra! Rex is the protagonist of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, a late 2017 follow-up of its now legendary predecessor that features an epic tale set in a world where people live on the bodies of colossal golem-like beings called Titans. Rex himself is a salvager, someone who delves into the sea of clouds that surrounds the Titans in search of scrap metal and other remnants of long-lost civilizations in order to sell them and support his home village. But Rex's story takes a much grander turn upon being recruited to a team investigating an ancient vessel that recently rose to the cloud sea's surface, as it is there where he finds Pyra. Pyra is a blade, a type of artificial life form capable of granting superhuman powers to their human partners, known as drivers. But while there are many blades and many drivers, Pyra herself, as it turns out, is a legendary blade known as the Aegis. After a near-death experience where Pyra saves Rex by connecting his own life force to hers, the two become inexorably bound, and out of gratitude, Rex offers to help Pyra with what she desires most, to return to Elysium, a fabled paradise that sits atop the colossal tree at the center of their world. Needless to say, things get a lot more complicated from there. You know how JRPGs tend to get. Other drivers join Rex and Pyra on their quest to reach Elysium and speak with the gods said to live there, as the Titans are slowly dying off and humanity is running out of places to live. Enemy factions seek to claim the Aegis for themselves and use her said to be limitless power for their own ends. The story gets increasingly heavy as things go on, even delving into some pretty deep philosophical stuff by the time all is said and done. Many Smash speculators had this pair penned as serious contenders for Ultimate's base game, myself included. But it turned out timing wasn't on their side. Development on Ultimate had begun much earlier than most of us had thought. Xenoblade 2's planned release window was too far away yet when the base roster was decided, and unlike a few past examples, Sakurai and crew didn't leave a placeholder for them to step into later in development. They wound up one of a few victims of unfortunate timing this time around, and Xenoblade 2 as a whole was left with a passable amount of secondary content instead. A handful of spirits, a couple music tracks, a brawler costume based on party member Nia, and, well, we gotta talk about it at some point. The abrupt reveal in November 2018 of a sword fighter costume based on Rex, meant as a bonus for purchasing the first Fighter's Pass, rubbed a lot of fans the wrong way, to put it lightly. It was one of several divisive moments in that Smash Direct, and significant parts of the community took up arms over it. "This is all Sakurai thinks he's good for?" cried out many of the reactions. "Less deserving than a generic Mario enemy?" That wasn't why it happened in hindsight, but there were a lot of knee-jerk reactions like that at the time. Not helping matters was a vague explanation that he'd been too new for the base roster, which didn't fully explain why he wound up a DLC costume when his home game was technically still relevant. Considering another Xenoblade 2 costume existed in the base game, it's enough to wonder if Rex's costume was also planned for the base game and a different one was going to be the Season 1 bonus and the two were swapped at some point, but that's just a personal theory of mine. More importantly, it doesn't provide the closure that Rex's fans are still left without. And yet, with a second Fighter's Pass now confirmed, and with a full set of 6 newcomers in tow, this pair might get a second chance, an opportunity to overcome the unfortunate timing that doomed their first one. We have seen multiple characters jump from NPC to playable before, including a particularly notable Mii costume. While every previous example did it between games, we are in an unprecedented situation here. And whenever the spirits and Mii costumes for the base game, and probably the Rex costume, were set up, would have happened long before talk of a second season of DLC was ever taken seriously. Back when it looked like the only way to include Rex and Pyra at all was in non-playable roles. Sakurai has outright said several of Ultimate's newcomers were chosen with fan demand in mind, including one who managed to overcome his lack of relevance because of it. And while Sakurai has also said he doesn't actively look to see which characters people are talking about mid-development, the responses toward the costume, for better or worse, mean his team must be aware there's still a lot of people hoping for Rex to join Smash for real. And for what it's worth, Xenoblade 2 does technically still have some relevance, because the next Xenoblade game coming up is a remake of the first game, and remakes and enhanced ports haven't really taken priority in the past when it comes to choosing newcomers. There are still some potential hangups in the way. We don't know if spirits or Mii costumes are eligible to graduate to playable in the same game, and the lack of Smash Ballot this time around makes it ambiguous how much the dev team is still tracking or prioritizing fan requests from recently. But I think the situation is favorable enough to make it worth giving these two a closer look. But now, let's take a closer look ourselves. If that second chance came to pass, what would Rex and Pyra be like in Smash? Let's put this team of Driver and Blade to the test. Rex's basic appearance would put him in his blue and gold Salvager gear straight from the game. And just like with Rex's Mii costume, Azurta would ride along in his helmet. Does that technically make this a trio? Pyra would also carry over her default design. Probably. She might need to get touched up a little to fit Ultimate's E10 rating better, but the fact that her current spirit left her original design as is seems to imply not much would need to be altered. At most, something in line with the minor changes given to the female versions of Corrin and Byleth. Something that probably would need some adjustments, though, is Rex's weapon. The Aegis sword he wields when fighting alongside Pyra is kind of really big in Xenoblade 2 proper. And while you could leave it as is, I think we'd want to have its size toned down in Smash because we already have Shulk doing the super long-range swordsman thing, and toning Rex's range down a little would help both characters still feel unique. And Smash has done something like this before. Cloud's Buster Sword in Smash is notably smaller than in canon. I'm picturing Rex ending up with range equal to or slightly less than Ike's sword Ragnell, varying based on each attack animation, which would still be pretty big, just not ridiculously so. But even if it's made a little smaller, and even though blade weapons seem to be lighter than they look, Rex's sword is still big and unwieldy, and his animation should reflect that of a 15-year-old kid who has to actively try to keep it under control. His attacks should rely more on huge swings, thrusts, and chopping motions, and less on precise cuts and slashes, especially since the Aegis sword relies on a stream of flame-like ether to deal damage more so than a sharp edge. And in another divergence from Shulk, Rex would carry his sword at all times while moving around instead of sticking it to his back when not attacking. It's one more way to help the two feel more distinct. One place Rex could pull from Shulk, though, is where his alternate colors come from, by basing most of them on his other party members. Palettes inspired by Nia, Tora, Vandam, Morag, and Zeke would offer some nice color variety on their own. Then Rex's 7th ult could take its palette from his ancestor Adam, who features heavily in Xenoblade 2's DLC expansion. His 8th could replace his outfit entirely with this set of armor he obtains late in the game, which I can't elaborate on further without dipping into spoiler territory. Pyra's colors would also change, and hers would match the color schemes of each of these characters' signature blades. Before we get in depth on Rex and Pyra's attributes, let's go over exactly how the two of them would function in battle, because the way they move and fight all revolves around their affinity. Directly inspired by combat in Xenoblade 2 and a mechanic of the same name from it, Pyra would follow Rex around and lend him her limitless power for his attacks. The more time they spend nearby each other mid-match, the more their affinity would build, and the stronger any of Rex's moves that utilize the Aegis Sword would become. Affinity would have 3 levels of strength just like in their game, indicated by a transparent energy tether that connects them when they're in close proximity and changes colors as their affinity strengthens. Basically, Pyra would be like a support version of Nana. She moves around and interacts with stuff independently under AI control, but instead of attacking, she provides buffs. Well, most of the time. While their affinity would rise as they stay close to each other, it also decrease over time when they're kept apart. So playing as Rex would involve protecting Pyra, just like he vows to in their game, to gain and keep the upper hand. Especially since Pyra also takes damage, does so separately the way Nana does, and while getting knocked out just leads to her respawning safely at mid-stage a short while later, it'd come at the cost of losing all of your affinity and having to build it back up from scratch. And if Rex himself bites it, so does Pyra. Their life forces are linked together after all. The affinity mechanic defines Rex and Pyra as fighters, and their playstyle is a direct reflection of that. The mechanic's very existence creates a kind of passive pressure that compels opponents to do something to get them away from each other, lest Rex get buffed up for free. Because when those buffs kick in, his big, disjointed sword attacks start also hitting hard and requiring respect. This also means Rex's game plan changes quite a bit based on what his current level of affinity is. At base level, just about everything he has is unsafe on block, forcing him to rely on punishes and very careful footsies. But level 2 affinity raises his damage enough to make many of his attacks safe when spaced properly, and level 3 affinity makes them safe as long as he isn't at point blank. It's a very dynamic setup that tasks Rex and Pyra players with adapting their game plan between baiting, spacing, and actively pressuring enemy shields based on what your current affinity allows you to do. Far as stats go, Rex is kinda on the short side by human standards. Guess he's a late bloomer? But he'd still be right around average compared to the wide variety of species on the roster. Pyra, though, is actually fairly tall. This has the added effect of also making her an easier target, meaning Rex has to actively guard Pyra while fighting and can't just stand in the way. Fortunately, Rex's salvager gear makes him heavier than average, putting him firmly in cruiserweight territory with the same weight value as Mega Man, slightly more than Cloud and Hero, and slightly less than Ryu and Ken. But Pyra is significantly lighter, on the upper end of the lightweights alongside Marth and Diddy Kong. The more damage she takes, the more easily she'll get separated from Rex when both are struck at the same time. But one look at that damage and KO power shows how much he gained from keeping Pyra close by. Maxed out affinity gives Rex the threat level of a heavy without half the drawbacks like a giant hurt box. But at the lowest level, those ratings aren't much to write home about. He has an okay time closing out stocks even then, but it sure gets easier when you've built your affinity up. Especially since, just like the current Xenoblade fighter, Rex's moves would be pretty laggy overall and require him to commit when he attacks. His frame data wouldn't be as bad as Shulk's since he does have a few non-sword moves in this concept, but it still isn't great overall and he really wants the safety afforded by higher affinity to make it less of a problem. The whole lugging a big sword around thing also factors into Rex's mobility, as it leaves him on the slow side of things when grounded. He's not super slow, and there are characters who've definitely proven that slow run speeds aren't a deal breaker, but it is still a downside. Pyra actually walks and runs a little faster than Rex, making it easier for her to catch up when they're both on the move. Nana's the same way. Did you know that? Their air stats are identical though, with airspeed that actually isn't half bad. Above average air movement means Rex wouldn't mind taking to the air in neutral, and gives him and Pyra a somewhat easier time landing against juggle attempts. Their above average fall speed would also help with that, but it'd also make them a little easier to combo than average, so heads up. But now, let's move on to the actual moveset. Just what could this unconventional setup for a fighter be capable of? Rex's jab is a 2-hit combo consisting of a straight punch with his left hand, taking it off his sword to do so, followed by a kick with his right foot. With alright startup by swordfighter standards at frame 5 and more damage than you'd expect on the second hit, it's an okay move overall. And it's deceptively good at catching spot dodges since it's one of those jabs where the first part repeats itself if you hold A until it hits something. This move isn't affected by affinity since it doesn't use the Aegis sword. Rex's forward tilt is a forceful downward sword swing pulled straight from one part of his standard combo in Xenoblade 2. An increasingly useful spacing tool the more affinity you have, making it functionally safe on block when spaced at level 2 affinity and safe even when only half spaced at level 3. For his up tilt, Rex swings his sword overhead from back to front, sort of like Lynx and Cloud's up tilts, but unlike every other sword fighter out there. It'd have good range but mediocre startup, with the animation showing Rex struggle a little to pull the sword over his head, but it also wouldn't have all that much end lag and even be able to combo into some stuff at low percents. Rex's down tilt has him thrust his sword forward at ground level from a crouching position, adapting another part of his neutral combo. A laggy but long-ranged poke in the vein of Banjo and Byleth, it'd be particularly useful for stabbing at opponents when your affinity's leveled up. Just don't get so predictable that your opponent jumps in over it. Switching things up, Rex's dash attack carries his running momentum into a short-lasting sliding kick before popping back up and into position again. A little less active than the other slide kicks out there, but it also has more knockback to push opponents away more easily. This move would also not be affected by affinity. How about something a little flashier? Rex's forward smash has him slam his sword down in front of him, creating a fiery ether explosion on impact with the ground. Dealing 2 hits in quick succession, it'd have at least 20 or more frames of startup, but with big hitboxes once it gets going, and a late hit on the explosion that lasts a few frames extra. It'd also be close to safe on block at medium affinity, at least against opponents with slow out of shield options, and straight up safe at high affinity unless you're right next to your target. Rex varies things up again for his up smash, ducking low and thrusting the Aegis sword straight up as a string of small explosions cover it for multiple hits and finish with a big one. I suppose it's sort of like Roy's up smash, but with a more exaggerated animation, slower startup, and larger hitboxes, especially the final one. Then Rex attempts a spin slash maneuver for his down smash, but the size of the Aegis sword makes it more difficult than with other swordsmen. More reliant on momentum to get the full spin, the animation would reflect that with slower startup than usual, and by Rex holding the sword outward more than other down smashes of this type, which gives it more horizontal reach, but also means low crouches would go under it. Oh, and worth mentioning that every attack involving the Aegis sword would have bright green motion trails, just like the ether on the sword itself, would make these smash attacks particularly eye-catching. Rex's aerials would be an important part of his game plan, and that begins with a neutral air that goes against type by not using his sword. Kicking defensively as best he can while holding on to his sword, Rex would have one of those long-lasting held kicks that haven't shown up on sword fighters other than 2 of the Lynx. Hitting around frame 6 would make it somewhat useful as a combo breaker, and pretty useful at clearing space in midair, though less so in Corrin's or Byleth's snares since this move doesn't have as big a hitbox. But the reduced knockback on the late hit would make landing there a useful combo starter at low to mid percents, but it'd have too much knockback growth to confirm it in knockouts at high percents. Rex's forward air is just a simple downward sword swing. May not be anything fancy, but it's an essential tool in his kit so he can space with falling fares in neutral and pressure shields at arm's length at higher affinity. It'd have a distinct animation at least, pulling the sword up and over his shoulder and using its size and momentum to bring it down. His back air has him spin around in midair and perform a horizontal slash that's another adaptation of one of his in-game attacks. Both a spacing and pressure tool, it'd be stronger than his forward air but less forgiving because of its narrower hitbox. Rex's up air is particularly unwieldy, heaving his sword up and over his head and using its size and weight to carve through anyone above him. While this move does have an arc motion to it, so it's not like Cloud's up air or anything, the actual hitbox wouldn't curve much because of how awkward the swing is, making the area that deals damage more like a big tilted rectangle instead. It'd also have quite a bit of startup, not hitting until around frame 13 or 14, but it'd KO off the top notably early the way Ike's up air does. And for his down air, Rex winds up and swings his sword straight down for a spike. While it's fairly typical for a sword down air to be like that, it would have a decently unique animation as he'd swing it at a slight diagonal angle and not just straight down. Now for Rex's grab game. His actual grabs would be pretty typical, with him taking one hand off the Aegis sword and reaching out. He would have slightly below average startup on them by swordfighter standards though. His pommel here just has him knee whoever he grabbed, again pretty typical. But it gets more interesting with his forward throw, which has him perform his sword bash combat art and send his target flying. This one actually has decent ability to score knockouts if used at the ledge, rewarding the player for actively pushing their opponent back at high percents. Rex's back throw is also based on sword bash, but with a bit more awkward of an animation and not quite as much knockback because of it. Can still KO if your back's at the ledge, but not until a while later than the forward throw would have at the opposite ledge. Then Rex's up throw has him fling the enemy straight up, and his down throw slams him off the ground and slightly forward. Both Rex's up and down throws and his pummel would not be affected by affinity. All 4 of his throws would have too much base knockback to use as combo starters. Even his down throw would be just a little too strong even at 0%, but maybe a doubles teammate could still capitalize on them? Finally, like with Schultz's taunts, Rex would combine dynamic poses and voice clips to intimidate and or disrespect the competition. Here are a few examples of what he could use. Couldn't resist with that last one. Pyra would also join in with her own animations, but they'd be more subdued to fit her personality. But just what can the Aegis and her driver truly do? Rex and Pyra's specials are where they show their true potential. And we begin at neutral with the Salvager specialty. Anchor Shot is, arguably, Rex's signature combat art in Xenoblade 2, firing the grappling anchor on his suit's forearm to latch onto an enemy and hold them in place for a follow-up slash. It also knocks loose a health potion or two for Rex or his allies to heal with, and after a certain point in the story, it also gains the ability to topple enemies over. For Smash, we're gonna maintain its original purpose while also adapting it a little. Pressing B has Rex square up and, after a short delay, fire the anchor straight ahead at a distance of about 1.5 times that of a tether grab. The first enemy that gets in the way is grabbed on the spot, at which point Rex pulls the anchor's rope down, dealing damage and toppling them by forcing them to trip. But if your affinity is maxed out, Pyra lends Rex enough strength to yank the rope back and deal set knockback that sends the enemy right to him instead for a free combo. This is all if you're on the ground though. In the air, the anchor is just a weak, disjointed hitbox instead, which has its own purposes. Anchor Shot is a cornerstone of Rex's arsenal and a serious threat at high affinity or high enemy percents. At bare minimum, the trip sets up tech chases you can capitalize on if you read what your opponent will do as you close the distance. At high affinity, it straight up confirms into stuff like a jab, tilt, or neutral or forward air, and even sets up KOs at around 130% onward. However, it's pretty slow to come out, a little slower than every actual tether grab in fact, and it also loses to shield like every other ranged command grab does. Good thing Rex can wear down enemy shields so well, huh? I'm unsure whether the mid-air version would be able to snap to ledges or not. It depends on what'd be best for overall balance. Next we have Rex's side special, and with one art accounted for already, how about another? Rolling Smash is another one of the arts available to Rex when wielding the Aegis sword. Deals damage in an area of effect while also somehow reducing the aggro of any enemy it hits, making them more likely to target a hopefully tankier ally instead. Using it in Smash has Rex leap forward, bring his sword up above him, then slam it down with a fiery impact as he lands. The jump at the start lets Rex go over low attacks, and his legs even become intangible as he's moving just like Little Max during Jolt Haymaker, interpreting the aggro reduction on the original version of the move by granting Rex increased ability to evade attacks during it. Higher levels of affinity even make the jump go a little higher and further, allowing you to cover more distance. Rolling Smash is a hard-hitting burst option with a big hitbox that lets you respond when an opponent overextends at mid-range or if they're just throwing out attacks too haphazardly and leaving themselves open. It even doubles as an emergency recovery move at ledge height, and the stronger your affinity, the better it becomes at all of this. But unlike Jolt Haymaker, the hit only happens at the end and you can't press a button to make it come out sooner, rendering this move completely useless out of shield. It's also unsafe on shield even if your affinity's maxed out, meaning you're always at risk if you keep fishing for it like an idiot. And using it in midair puts you into freefall afterwards, so careful. Okay, I bet you're wondering, are all of these just going to be combat arts? And, well, this one is at least. Double Spinning Edge is another art available through the Aegis sword. A nice, solid 2-hit damage dealer that gets even stronger if you strike an enemy from the side. But we're going to take some creative liberties here and invert it to make it a recovery move. For our version, Rex propels himself into the air with a big looping slash. The sheer momentum from it pulls him into a backflip, and he uses the momentum from that to perform a second looping slash that sends enemies flying. Higher levels of affinity grant slightly quicker startup to the move and allows Rex to grab ledges sooner afterward. Unlike Shulk's Air Slash, you get both hits from a single button press, and the knockback at the end is more diagonal instead of straightforward. A decent recovery move that doubles as a big anti-air, double spinning edge is useful for both offense and defense. It also becomes an increasingly decent out-of-shield option the higher your affinity, and even works as a follow-up for a max affinity anchor shot for that aforementioned KO setup in what undoubtedly become Rex's signature combo. But this move's also a big commitment with rigid, predictable movement that puts you into freefall afterward and leaves you a sitting duck if you miss. And considering the fact that you can't grab ledges until some point after the second slash is done, it'd be susceptible to certain ledge traps and even counters if you don't space it carefully. You know, every one of these attacks so far has just been Rex doing the hard work while Pyra gets left out. Is she going to get to do more than just sit back and provide support? Well, that's where their down special comes in. As the name implies, blade specials are special attacks performed by blades that are made available once you've built up a gauge by using combat arts. Each unique blade has multiple specials they can use, and which one you get when you go for one is based on the blade's current level of affinity with their driver in that battle. See where this is going yet? Pressing down and B has Rex toss his sword up quickly, and it vanishes and reappears in Pyra's hands. Then she performs one of 3 distinct attacks on the spot based on your current level of affinity. At level 1, she uses Flame Nova, a simple yet fast spin attack with the sword wreathed in fire. Level 2 affinity has her use Prominence Revolt, thrusting the sword downward and creating a large pillar of fire on the spot. And level 3 affinity lets her perform Blazing End, where she leaps back and throws the sword forward, causing it to spin rapidly in place for multiple hits. If you notice, all 3 would cover a more or less similar area while escalating in range and damage. Blade specials give Rex and Pyra a surprise option to catch opponents off guard by putting a hitbox somewhere it wouldn't normally be, racking up damage and gaining, or keeping, the upper hand if you connect. It'd work especially well as part of a ledge trap or covering attempts to roll behind you in general. But that sheer effectiveness would be kept in check by how impractical this is to use. Since you can't fully control where Pyra goes and can only influence her since she tries to follow you, it's less about having super consistent setups and more about recognizing when the right opportunity comes up. And Rex also kinda can't attack when Pyra has his sword, and his mobility is reduced since his focus is elsewhere, meaning he becomes the vulnerable one while Pyra is attacking. But did you know there are level 4 blade specials as well? Available only if you've built it up just right and your affinity is maxed out. Pyra's level 4 special is a fitting choice for the pair's final smash. Using the energy of a smash ball as a shortcut to tap into that power, Rex focuses and performs a leaping slash. If anyone gets caught, they're knocked to center stage and left defenseless as Rex follows and Pyra warps to his position to stand at his side and the two take hold of the sword together. Then, the Aegis and her driver act in perfect sync, leaping skyward and plunging the sword down as they fall, with enough force to rupture the ground and unleash a towering vortex of flame that scours any and all foes caught within. A display of power capable of bringing down the mightiest of enemies. And yet, it's merely a fragment of the true power of the Aegis. All of this is what Rex and Pyra could bring to Smash. A humble salvager and living superweapon whose lives have intertwined and now traverse their world in hopes of saving it. Though they were too late to join the fight the first time around, the combined efforts of their distinct fighting style and enduring fanbase might just give them a second chance. Built around using the power, disjointed range, and relative safety of the Aegis sword, Rex and Pyra can punish overextensions, outspace enemy attacks, and pressure opponents into dropping their defenses. With multiple reliable ways to end stocks, they'd rarely have to fish for their finishers or worry about opponents living to super high percents. And the affinity mechanic and the momentum it grants can make them a near unstoppable force when they get the ball rolling. However, they're significantly less of a threat if they can't get that momentum going, like if an opponent's using strong stage control tools to keep the two of them separated. Many of their attacks range from mediocre to outright weak at low affinity, requiring careful use of a temporarily underpowered moveset until you can build it up further. And the fact that most of their attacks are pretty slow or carry significant end lag makes them susceptible to getting out-framed in close quarters or punished when they have to commit to something and it doesn't work. So, hope I managed to do these characters justice with my take on them. There are several other directions a moveset for Rex could go in, but I wanted to focus on affinity because I felt it'd make for something that'd stand out. Not to say some other concepts I've seen, like the ones where he swaps between multiple blades, aren't interesting. I just think changing between movesets like that potentially runs too close to Pokemon Trainers' thing. I also ended up deciding not to include Mithra, Pyra's alter ego slash, well, it's complicated and spoilery. It felt like including her on top of the affinity mechanic would have been one major thing too many, so I kept things comprehensible. Admittedly, it'd be weird for her to not show up anywhere, but we also didn't expect Byleth to not use Divine Pulse, so who knows? Maybe we could use her level 4 Blade special for the final smash instead? Xenoblade's been getting the short end of the stick in Ultimate so far, especially with how much the series has grown in the past 10 years. Hopefully we see more substantial content at some point, preferably sooner rather than later. Fingers crossed, right? And hey, if you enjoyed my ideas here, don't forget to subscribe and click the little bell icon down below so you'll know when more is ready. Trust me, do you really want to risk missing out because the algorithms never bothered to show it to you? Special thanks to these people for their continued support and or assistance, and especially to my patrons. You guys are a godsend in times like these, seriously. If you want to become a patron yourself, check out the link down in the description. And so, until next time, things are pretty scary right now, but as long as we're careful, we can get through this.